Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Very good, very well.
Good.
So let's talk about money and military spending. We spend a lot on military. Is this spending for national defense, or is this spending for other things? But it's in the news right now about an initiative that it really started in 2014 with NATO deciding to advance to the borders of Russia and changing the leadership with a coup in Ukraine, so on and on. But since that time, they established at that time a group called the European Deterrence Initiative, and a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe $5 billion. But just recently it was in the news about what they were going to do with some of this. And I guess it's going to make a few people happy. It'll be good for jobs. A narrow number of people with jobs who's in the business of weaponry, and it won't be just the Americans that will benefit by this. There will be other companies that will benefit, and it will all be sold national security interests, peace in the world, peace through strength, all this thing. But once again, it looks to me like it's just a continuation of the biggest boondoggle that we have. It's one of the biggest boondoggles, and it's a continuation of the military-industrial complex coming out pretty well on this. So we'll have to check and discuss a little bit about how Donald Trump fits in on this. This money, it looks like it was just recently appropriated in this last bill. That means Donald Trump is for Europe first or something like that.
Well, there was a panic among the military-industrial complex after the end of the Cold War. What are we going to do now? We had all this money. People were talking about peace dividend, and so they had to ramp up the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, and on it's gone since then. So this European Defense Initiative was launched in 2014. Here's the European Command release about it, and here's the justification. Following Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine in 2014, the U.S. authorized the European Deterrence Initiative. So there are a few things wrong with that. First of all, the whole thing was essentially then, if this is the rationale, it was based on something that's not true. There was not a Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Otherwise, we would have seen the video. We know what an invasion looks like. Russia was interested in a coup next door that the U.S. led, but a Russian invasion, we know what Russian military action looks like. We saw it in Syria. So why is there no video? So the whole thing is based on a lie. And we're talking billions of dollars.
Well, somebody has to be behind this, and the politicians go along with it. And you wonder whether the politicians who vote for these programs, and they get a large bipartisan support for this. But interestingly enough, there's a few more negative votes against this type of thing than there were when I was in Congress. Sometimes we were down to 5 to 10 people. Yeah. Now it's maybe up to 60 or 70, but it still doesn't answer the question. There's tremendous support for this. And people who vote against it are painted as unpatriotic and not for America, and they're going to not work for national security. And besides, Russians are the aggressors. And matter of fact, this headline points it out. U.S. to spend $214 million. This is just on air bases.
Yeah.
European air bases on the pretext of Russian aggression. Pretext is the right word in that thing, because obviously, just from what you said, there's no evidence to show that they had invaded anybody, and this is just more reason to justify more spending for some special interest groups, and it's probably an international group because the money is going to be spent over there. But then it introduces the whole other notion that Trump's position is, we have to be strong and support him, and even if we have to do it, and he changed his position on NATO, and NATO has to be strong, but we'll make them pay. So my question is, do you think that Trump is going to collect on this and all this money being spent, this $5 billion? Do you think the American taxpayer is going to get taken care of, or will the American taxpayer be last, not first?
That's true, and he did sign it. His signature was on the Defense Appropriations Bill that became law earlier this month, and that included almost $5 billion for this European Defense Initiative. Of course, because it's government, that was up from only $700 million in 2016. So there's a lot of growth. Did the threat grow in that meantime? We don't know. But the $200 million you're talking about to upgrade European air bases. That comes from, there are four legs of the European Deterrence Initiative. Increase U.S. troop presence in Europe, that's $1.7 billion. 217 million for exercises and training, 337 million for improved infrastructure, and that's what this is part of, and another 267 million to strengthen the ability of our allies to defend themselves in Europe.
You know,
so this is our money, tax money being spent in Europe.
Sometimes I think the propaganda, the pretext sounds like it's 1939 all over again. If that were the case, and they have learned that you have to be very cautious, you'd think that Germany would understand this.
Of all places, yeah.
They are very wealthy, and the wealthiest country in Europe, and yet they're not spending a whole lot on military. You know, I always was amazed that the Nazis, you know, they didn't even have ports, yet they had hundreds, if not thousands, of submarines, which were powerful and up to date and the best ones in the world. And yet, understand that Germany doesn't even have a submarine anymore, and yet Russia aggression is coming. You'd think, you know, some submarines for defensive purposes, if nothing else, up in the Baltic areas, you know, Baltic Sea, that you would have some submarines, but they don't even have a submarine. So do you think they might not be as worried as they're supposed to be? We better warn the Germans, wake up, the Russians are coming.
Can you imagine if you were concerned about aggression, you would do something? Their last submarine that was working ran into a piece of ice somewhere around Norway, ran into a rock, actually. And now it's dry docked, so they have 0 subs. They'll have a couple of subs late in 2018, but essentially they have no submarines. The U.S. spends about 4% of its GDP on military. The Germans spend about 1%. So if there's this great crisis, the Russians are coming, unless they're stupid, you'd think they'd start spending more money to defend themselves.
Yes, and we can hide behind NATO and sometimes even the United Nations, but this also involves an empire, and it seems like it makes more sense in trying to understand this if you think of it as an American empire, and that they have to run the show. Now, American first could mean we're going to stay in charge of the empire, and maybe they're sensing the fact that the American empire is not as strong as it used to be, militarily and financially, even though under the circumstances of what we're talking about, it depends totally on the American taxpayer. But the American taxpayer is not all that, you know, wealthy. Yes, stock market's doing good, but middle-class Americans aren't, you know, making a ton of money off there. But the cost of this is astronomical, and it may be this panic. How are we going to protect our interests? Our interest usually means the empire, the control, and where can we put on sanctions, and where can we have financial penalties, and all these things going on. And I think the plate is awfully full. I think there are signs out there that the empire is coming to an end, not next week, but this means they have to be more aggressive and throw their weight around, which we are doing here. Yes, they're participating. These people like our money and our bases.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, not because they're frightened, not because of aggression, because they see this as military Keynesianism. That's what they see. They don't understand the market. They think if we just pump money in there, yeah, there's short-term benefits from that. But it really doesn't solve the problem of a functioning marketplace where the country becomes wealthier because of production. No, it's sort of a welfare system. They become dependent on it. And so long-term, even the countries that see this as a boondoggle and a wonderful thing that they're getting American taxpayers' money, I think they're going to wake up and be surprised one day that they don't have many benefits and we'll be holding the bag. There's going to be a lot of debt. And I think when I think about America first, I think we ought to protect the American taxpayers and the liberties of American citizens. I'd like to do that worldwide, but that's not the way it works. The only responsibility for American citizens is try to perfect our system, which means we should look carefully at our foreign policy, our monetary policy, our spending policies, and try to bring peace to the world, but not this way. This is just a disaster. It represents what happens when money is printed out of thin air and they get away with doing this. Can you imagine the American people saying, most of them don't have the vaguest idea about this money being spent. But can you imagine what it'd be like if they knocked on the door of every American citizen and said that, the Russians are about to invade Europe. They don't spend any money on their defense. And we need $5 billion and your share is $150. Not much. Oh, yeah. But what if they did that for everything, every war, everything? Then they might know. But no, nobody pays anything because you just print the money. And as long as the world takes their dollars, they get away with this. But it's fragile. It'll come to an end.
And we say it a lot on the show, but the American middle class in the middle of the country needs to understand how they're being ripped off. The 3 richest counties in the United States are those counties around Washington, D.C., where the military-industrial complex is located. These are extraordinarily well-paid jobs, and they're well-paid, and they exist, and they expand because of this unholy alliance between the military-industrial complex, which funds think tanks, which put out reports that the media picks up talking about more threats. Those threats go into the appropriation, which indeed feeds the military-industrial complex, and it's an endless loop that ramps up, and the U.S. citizens are being forced to pay for things based on propaganda, based on lies.
And what they have convinced so many is that costs don't matter. They've been taught that deficits aren't all that bad. And the other thing is the American people are oblivious to all this, and that is the big problem. But eventually they will have to pay for it, and I think that day is coming.
Well, you mentioned President Trump in all this, and that's a key factor because we were happy on the campaign trail when he said, "What do we have NATO for? This thing's outdated." But instead of make them pay, the rich Europeans, it's really making the Americans pay. But he had a rally a couple of weeks ago out in Pensacola, and he had a couple of good quotes on here. And I wonder if he had these quotes in mind when he signed this bill that gave the Europeans so much money. If I can just read a couple. Here's what he said. You got to pay. You got to pay. You don't pay, we're out of there, right? Sounds pretty good in his own way. And then he said, and I think this is how he really gets it, because I think he's explaining in his own way the idea of moral hazard. He said, so we'll have a nation that doesn't pay. Then their nation gets frisky with whoever, Russia. So we have a nation that doesn't pay. That nation gets aggressive. We end up in World War III. That's a pretty good example of moral hazard. They don't pay for their defense. They know that they're being backed up by the U.S., so they get frisky in his own terms and provoke someone into a war.
Maybe we should buy a couple buses, send the buses over there and say, get on, you're coming out of here, and ship them on home. What a different world it would be. But it's been going on for a long time, and I'm afraid it will continue. And I also see as a consequence of all this, in order to keep stability, the stability necessary after a 9/11 instead of looking at foreign policy, the stability is the undermining of personal freedoms here in this country, which undermines the productivity of the country and then encourages the maldistribution of all wealth. We've already talked about the maldistribution of the wealth going toward, the military-industrial complex, and somebody is paying for this. There is a cost. But one thing that, in this current debate on the tax bill and the spending bills in Washington, the liberal Democrats aren't too happy with it. And they are so concerned and they are so outraged. And they said, you're going to increase the deficits. Mm-hmm. And this is the reason that we don't want you to do this. We don't want you to increase the deficit like they really cared. They play on that. But even though when the Republicans are concerned about the deficits, they don't do anything about them either. So they don't really believe that deficits hurt. But debt does hurt, because one way or another, it always gets paid for, and eventually it gets paid for almost always when it gets to this condition, is paid for through the debasement of currency. People's bills get paid, but you get paid with money that doesn't buy very much. And that, of course, what would happen. I mean, just look at every day. There's a story about pension funds that are bad, and how are they going to do it? Even today, there was a story about the pension funds for firefighters and policemen in Dallas, Texas. Rich Texas, and their pension funds are broke, and the police are quitting because they thought, well, they're short policemen there. And if that can happen in very wealthy Texas, you can imagine what's going on. And you know, when you think about Chicago and Detroit and all these other places, and it's spreading because the extravagance has to be paid for. It's just that it's paid for in a different manner. It's sophisticated monetizing of debt and printing of money. And believe me, this is going to get much worse because all they do is spend more money, no matter who's in office.
Well, of this $200 million that's being spent to upgrade European bases, you have Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. They're going to get an infusion of our cash. But also, this money is going to Luxembourg, Iceland, and Norway. Those are pretty wealthy countries, you know, and we're fixing up their bases. You know, since 9/11, we spent about $5 trillion on foreign wars, according to Brown University's Cost of War project. Now, some of that was justified because we were attacked on 9/11, but there were certainly a lot of wars of choice. Imagine if using the Paul formula, and of that $5 trillion, half of it went to pay down the debt, and then half of it may have gone to, instead of upgrading bases in Norway, maybe upgrading the roads in the U.S. or what have you. You know, just half and half. Imagine how different the country would have been.
And that was my idea of a transition, because, you know, if you just cut it off, people get a little nervous. But if you would hope that maybe some progressives would join us. But, you know, it's a shame that the progressive just disappeared totally and completely. And the anti-war movement really doesn't exist. And I've thought about that, and there are some people who talk about maybe it shouldn't be called anti-war, you know, maybe the title ought to be pro-peace. I keep thinking, you know, Reagan used peace through strength. I think maybe we should start something called peace through common sense.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, there you have it, $5 billion wasted on rich Europeans. It's gone.
Good, and we'll just call up Mr. Trump. I'm sure he'll take my call, and I'll say, Mr. Trump, you had promised to make these countries pay. Are they going to pay? Which is just being silly, because I don't think he really believed that himself. And he must be smart enough to realize this is money out the door. This is money that is demanded to maintain the empire. And even though it's all described as America first, unfortunately, in the situation we're talking about here, it's Europeans first, the American taxpayers last. That's tragic. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.